Right. Hello and welcome. Today's presentation is on assembly areas and the 2010 ADA standards. Please remember that any materials provided by Washington Civil and Disability Advocate, WACDA, are for informational purposes only and are not legal advice. WACDA is not responsible for the consequences of your reliance on any materials provided. Your use of informational materials does not create an attorney-client relationship or any other relationship, or the expectation of confidentiality between you and WACDA. Views expressed in informational materials are those of the individual author and may not reflect the views of WACDA or its individual staff members. If you need legal advice, you must seek advice from an attorney regarding specific legal issues. All right, so to begin, I'll just give a brief overview of the general requirements for Section 221, which covers assembly areas. Section 802 will also cover assembly areas, but this is more the technical requirements for the width, depth, and other specifications for wheelchair spaces and for companion seats and designated aisle seats. In general, Section 221 says that assembly areas shall provide wheelchair spaces, companion seats, and designated aisle seats complying with 221 and 802. This means that all assembly areas qualifying as places of public accommodation under Title III of the ADA must comply with Section 221 regulations. Assembly areas are places of public accommodation that accommodate large groups of people, such as public theaters, museums, concert halls, arts and performing arts centers, stadiums, arenas, and lecture halls. The purpose of these regulations that we're going to cover is to provide the minimum requirements for newly designed, constructed, or altered places of public accommodation. It's important to note that the ADA standards do not override state or local accessibility standards. Rather, both sets of standards must be met. Where there are differences between standards, the standard that provides greater accessibility must be followed. Another important note is that when it comes to enforcing the requirements of the 2010 ADA standards, these are issued under a civil rights law. Therefore, they can only be enforced through litigation by private individuals or complaints filed with federal agencies. These standards are not building codes and are not enforced as such. Essentially, entities covered by the ADA are also responsible for ensuring their own compliance. The 2010 standards will apply to any facility or part of a facility that was constructed or altered on or after March 15th, 2012. Even though the standards were enacted in 2010, there was a safe harbor period given before the requirements will go into effect. Section 221.2 requires all assembly areas with fixed seating to provide designated wheelchair spaces. Fixed seating consists of chairs or seating that are not portable or stackable. Fixed seating is secured to the ground in some fashion. However, this does not include assembly seating found in sports venues, including indoor gymnasiums with fixed bleachers. The number and location of wheelchair spaces are determined by Table 221.2.1.1. This summarizes the number of wheelchair spaces that must be provided according to the total number of seats in the assembly area. For example, if there are 4 to 25 total seats in the assembly area, there must be a minimum of 1 wheelchair space. If there are 301 to 500 numbers of seats in the assembly area, there must be at least 6 wheelchair spaces. Luxury boxes, club boxes, or suites within arenas or stadiums or grandstands must each individually comply with the box on the previous slide. In other words, each box is assessed separately to determine the required number of accessible seats within it. These seats are not factored into the entire seat count for the overall arena. There are also separate requirements for other boxes. These include box seating provided in performing arts buildings where there are tiered boxes for spatial and acoustical purposes. To determine the total number of wheelchair spaces required in these other boxes, you would take the total number of box seats in these other boxes, add them together, and then to refer to table 221.2.1.1. Then the resulting number of wheelchair spaces must be located in no fewer than 20% of all the boxes covered in this section. This creates dispersion of wheelchair seating amongst the boxes so that it can not all be clustered in one single box. The 2010 standards require that wheelchair spaces must be an integral part of the seating plan. This requirement means that wheelchair spaces must be designed into the overall architecture and design of the seating area. Wheelchair spaces cannot be segregated from general seating areas or tacked on at the back of seating sections. This integration requirement prevents the ghettoization of wheelchair spaces and individuals with disabilities. A few other quick requirements is that for every wheelchair seat or wheelchair space complying with Section 221, there must be one companion seat. So you can't set wheelchair spaces off in their own section surrounded by other wheelchair spaces. They need to each have one companion seat. Additionally, at least 5% of the total number of aisle seats provided shall be wheelchair spaces and should be located closest to the nearest accessible routes. And finally, wherever there is lawn seating and exterior overflow seating areas, even though there is no fixed seating provided, these seats must still connect to an accessible route.
We're now going to pivot and discuss the sightline requirements at assembly areas. So in providing lines of sight, wheelchair spaces must be dispersed. Wheelchair spaces need to provide spectators with choices of seating location and viewing angles that are substantially equivalent to or better than the choices of seating locations and viewing angles available to all other spectators. Section 802.2 requires that there are lines of sight to the screen, performance area, or playing field for spectators in wheelchair spaces. There are two key lines of sight. The first is lines of sight over seated spectators. Where spectators are expected to remain seated during events, spectators in wheelchair spaces must be afforded lines of sight complying with Section 802.2. Second, there must be equivalent lines of sight for overstanding spectators. Where spectators are provided lines of sight over the heads of spectators in the first row in front of their seats, spectators seated in the wheelchair spaces must be provided lines of sight over their heads in the first row in front of the wheelchair spaces. Additionally, there must be equivalent lines of sight in between the heads. Where spectators are provided lines of sight over the shoulders and between the heads of spectators seated in the first row in front of their seats, spectators seated in wheelchair spaces shall be afforded lines of sight over the shoulders and between the heads of seated spectators in the first row in front of wheelchair spaces. There are two different kinds of dispersion requirements, vertical and horizontal. Section 221 requires that wheelchair spaces must be dispersed horizontally. Horizontal dispersion is the placement of spaces in an assembly facility seating area from side to side, or if it's in an arena or stadium, around the field or performance area. There are two exceptions to this rule. First, horizontal dispersion is not required in assembly areas with 300 or fewer seats if the companion seats required by 221.3 and wheelchair spaces are located within the second or third quartile of the total row length. Second, in row seating, two wheelchair spaces are permitted to be located side by side. So the second kind of dispersion is vertical. Wheelchair spaces must also be dispersed vertically at varying distances from the screen, performance area, or playing field. When wheelchair spaces are dispersed vertically in an assembly facility, they are placed at different locations within the seating area from front to back so that the distance from the stage or playing field is varied among the wheelchair spaces. Additionally, wheelchair spaces shall be located in each balcony or mezzanine that is located on an accessible route. Again, there are two exceptions. First, vertical dispersion is not required if the assembly area has 300 seats or less, if the viewing angles for wheelchair spaces are equivalent to the average viewing angles. Second, in bleachers, Wheelchair spaces are not required in rows other than the rows at points of entry to the bleacher seating. The next category of important information about assembly areas is regarding ticketing. So in 2010 ADA regulations, there were 6 significant changes, one of which included ticketing. So accessible seats are the spaces that are specifically designed for wheelchairs. They include features such as an accessible approach, location at grade, clear floor space, and larger dimensions. Wheelchair spaces and wheelchair space locations in assembly areas with spectator seating must comply with Section 802, which goes into all of the ticketing regulations. So first, who can purchase and use these accessible seats? Patrons with mobility disabilities, such as someone who uses a wheelchair or other mobility devices, someone who cannot climb stairs or walk long distances. Patrons who have a disability that requires the use of an accessible feature of a wheelchair location can make these purchases, such as someone who cannot sit in a straight back chair or whose service dog cannot fit under a non-accessible seat. Finally, companions and the patron who is purchasing the ticket for someone who meets the above conditions may purchase accessible seats. I'm now going to walk through the 8 different sections of ticketing regulations. The first is ticket sales. Venues are required to sell tickets for accessible seats in the same manner and under the same conditions as all other tickets. There are 3 main requirements. The tickets for accessible seats must be sold in the same hours. They must be sold through the same methods of purchase. So this can be over the phone, online, in person. And they must be sold during the same stages of sale. So that can be pre-sale, promotions, general sales, things like that. The second regulation is ticket prices. Venues are not allowed to charge higher prices for accessible seats, and this includes the service charges that are added to the cost of a ticket. Venues must offer accessible seats in all the same price categories that are offered to the public. So the next category is about the identification of seating. Venues are required to provide the same information about accessible seats as is provided for non-accessible seats. So this means using the same text and the same visuals. Accessible seats must be described in enough detail to allow the purchaser to determine if a seat meets their needs. If a venue has a map or a display of a seating configuration on a website, as is shown on the screen, it must include information on accessible seating in the same level of detail as provided for non-accessible seating. People purchasing a ticket for an accessible seat may purchase up to 3 additional seats for their companion. These seats must be contiguous and in the same row. If the contiguous seats have already been sold, the venue must offer other seats as close as possible to the accessible seat. So regarding group sales, many venues offer a group sales rate for groups of a predetermined size. If a group includes 1 or more individuals who need accessible seating, the entire group should be seated together in that area that includes accessible seating. Tickets must be allocated in a way so that the individuals with disabilities are not isolated from others in their group. So the hold and release of tickets. In general, tickets for accessible seats cannot be sold to members of the general public who do not need the specific features of accessible seats. There are 3 specific circumstances in which unsold accessible seats may be released and sold to members of the general public. Venues must select only one of these options for declaring a sellout for an event. So really quick, going back down to the definition of sold out, when all seats for sale in the venue or designated area have been sold with the exception of holds. So there are 3 exceptions. The first is when all non-accessible seats have been sold. When all non-accessible seats in a particular seating area have been sold, then unsold accessible seats in that section may be released. Also, when all non-accessible seats in a particular price category have been sold, unsold accessible seats in that price category may be released. Holds include tickets for a company, a promoter, press, development, or forum manager. So once the venue or event is determined to be sold out, wheelchair and companion seats may be released for general sale. The next part of ticketing regulations is regarding transfers. So often venues permit patrons to transfer their tickets, and if a venue allows patrons to sell their tickets to others, this exact same right must be extended to those with disabilities who hold tickets for accessible seats and to persons with disabilities who intend to buy or receive tickets on a secondary ticket market. But an individual with a ticket for an accessible seat can transfer it to anyone, including someone who does not have a disability. So venues cannot require that accessible seats only be transferred to someone with a disability. The eighth and final category of this regulation is regarding fraud prevention. So venues cannot require proof of disability as a condition for purchasing tickets for accessible seats. But venues and third-party vendors can take steps to prevent the fraudulent sale and use of accessible seating. So for single event tickets, venues can ask purchasers to state that they require the features of an accessible seat. If you're purchasing a series of event tickets, like season tickets, purchasers may be asked to attest in writing they require or are purchasing tickets for someone who requires the features of an accessible seat. Venues can also mark tickets to clearly identify that they are for accessible seats, such as the ticket on the screen. A sample online attestation can ask someone to check a box, acknowledging that they are purchasing wheelchair accessible seats that are for use by a person with a disability who requires accessible seating. Although this is not required under the regulations, venues are heavily encouraged to provide comprehensive and ongoing staff training to ensure successful compliance with these laws and the new ticketing regulations. The training should aim to make staff aware of these policies, and they should know how to implement them. If you're looking for additional resources about assembly areas, there are 3 great websites for additional information. The U.S. Access Board has their ADA accessibility guidelines. The 2010 ADA standards for accessible design are also available. And the ADA National Network Disability Law Handbook has helpful references as well. Thank you.